Okay, chapter 3 is embryology. So sexual reproduction is a process by which the gametes, or the sperms, unite with the female gamete, the secondary oocyte. So pregnancy is a sequence of events that begins with fertilization, then it goes to implantation, embryonic development, fetal development, and it normally ends with birth around 38 weeks later. So from fertilization through the 8th week of development, the developing human is called an embryo, and this stage is called the embryonic period. The fetal period begins at week 9 and it continues until birth. So during this time, the developing fetus, human, is called a fetus. So the embryonic period. The first 2 months, the 3 major events of that period are the development of the embryonic tissue, the embryonic membranes, and the placenta. The first week of development is when fertilization takes place, and during this, the genetic material from the haploid spermatozoon, or simply a sperm, and a haploid secondary oocyte merges into a single diploid nucleus. Fertilization normally occurs in the uterus, the fallopian tube, about 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. So sperms swim due to the action of their tails, that flagella, from the vagina into the cervical canal, the journey through the rest of the uterus and then into the uterine tubes, which results mainly from contractions of the walls of these organs. So when the spermatozoon has entered a secondary oocyte, its nucleus develops into a male pronucleus, and then the nucleus of the ovum develops into a female pronucleus, and the 2 pronuclei then fuse to form a single diploid nucleus that contains 46 chromosomes, 23 from each pronucleus. So the fertilized ovum is called a zygote. Cleavage of the zygote. After fertilization, rapid mitotic cell divisions called cleavage occurs. The progressively smaller cells produced by cleavage are called the blastomeres, and the solid sphere of blastomeres still surrounded by the zona pellucida is called the morula, and it's about the same size as the original zygote. Next we have the blastocyst formation. So after 4 or 5 days, the morula travels through the uterine tubes, it enters the uterine cavity, and it develops into the blastocyst. And at the 32 cell stage, fluid enters the morula to form a fluid-filled blastocyst cavity. And the developing blastocyst has the following components. Number 1, it has an embryoblast, or inner cell mass, which develops into the embryo. 2, an outer covering of cells called the trophoblast. It ultimately forms the outer chorionic sac. And the blastocyst cavity, the blastocele, blastocele, about 5 days after fertilization, the blastocyst hatches from the zona pellucida. So then we have implantation. It occurs about 6 days after fertilization, a process by which the blastocyst attaches to and embeds itself within the endometrium. Second week of development. Development of the trophoblast develops 2 layers in the region of contact between the blastocyst and the endometrium. The outer syncytiotrophoblast, which secretes enzymes that enable the blastocyst to penetrate into the endometrium. Number 2, the inner cytotrophoblast that is composed of distinct cells, and these 2 layers of trophoblasts become part of the chorion as they undergo further growth. So the trophoblast produces human chorionic gonadotrophin, HCG. Development of the second week, the inner cell mass differentiates into the hypoblast, which is a primitive endoderm, and the epiblast, the primitive ectoderm, which together form a flat disc called the bilaminar embryonic disc. A small cavity appears in the epiblast and eventually enlarges to form the amniotic cavity. A thin protective membrane that forms from the epiblast and initially overlies the bilaminar embryonic disc as the embryo grows, and the amnion comes to completely surround the embryo, creating an amniotic cavity that becomes filled with amniotic fluid. So this fluid serves as a shock absorber for the fetus. It helps to regulate the fetal body temperature, and it prevents adhesions between the fetal skin and the surrounding tissue, because without that fluid, all that rubbing together, you would have friction, and that would be awful. So the embryonic cells are sloughed off into the amniotic fluid, and they may be examined by amniocentesis. And the amnion usually ruptures just before birth, and it's called the bag of waters, or we normally say someone's water broke. The development of the yolk sac. In humans, the yolk sac is relatively empty, small, and progressively decreases in size, but it has several important functions, including supplying nutrients during the 2nd and 3rd weeks of development, providing blood cells during the 3rd through the 6th week, and it containing the cells that will eventually differentiate into the primitive germ cells. So it forms part of the gut, it acts as a shock absorber, and it prevents dehydration of the embryo. Small spaces called lacunae develop within the syncytiotrophoblasts, and the lacuna fuse to form larger interconnected lacunar networks of endometrial capillaries that expand to form the sinusoids. The maternal blood and the endometrial secretions enter the lacunar networks to provide embryonic nutrition and to serve as disposal sites for the embryonic waste. The extraembryonic mesoderm develops about the 12th day after fertilization. The mesodermal cells form a connective tissue around the amnion and the yolk sac cavities, and a large number of cavities develop, which then fuse to form a single layer called the extraembryonic colon. The chorion develops from the trophoblasts and the extraembryonic mesoderm. It surrounds the embryo and later the fetus. The chorion eventually becomes the major embryonic component of the placenta, and it protects the embryo and the fetus from the maternal immune responses, and it produces human chorionic gonadotrophin, HCG. So the inner layer of the chorion eventually fuses with the amnion, and the extraembryonic column is now called the chorionic cavity, and the bilaminar embryonic disc becomes connected to the trophoblast by connecting the body stalk, and the future is the future umbilical cord. All right, your 3rd week of development. This is gastrulation. So the bilaminar embryonic disc is transformed into a trilaminar embryonic disc consisting of 3 primary germ layers: the ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. Ecto on the outside, meso in the middle, endo on the inside. Neurulation. The notochord induces formation of the neural plate, whose lateral edges of the latter develop into the neural folds. The depression between the latter is called the neural groove, and the neural folds fuse, resulting in the formation of the neural tube, which subsequently develops into the brain and the spinal cord. So the embryonic process by which the neural plate, the neural folds, and the neural tube form is called neurulation. Next, we have the development of the somites. So cube-shaped structures formed from mesoderm. Each somite differentiates into a myotome, which develops into the skeletal muscles of the neck, trunk, and limbs, and a dermatome, which forms connective tissue, including the dermis, and a sclerotome, which develops into the vertebra and the ribs. So development of the intraembryonic colon. These are small spaces that appear in the lateral plate mesoderm, and they merge into a larger cavity called the intraembryonic colon. So consequently, the lateral plate mesoderm is split into the splenic mesoderm and the somatic mesoderm, each of which will develop into specific structures. Okay, next is development of the cardiovascular system. So angiogenesis, the formation of blood vessels, begins when the mesodermal cells differentiate into the hemangioblasts, which then develop into the angioblasts, which then aggregate to form the blood islands. The latter develop into the blood vessels. The blood cells arise from the pluripotent stem cells, and the heart develops when the cardiogenic area forms a pair of endocardial tubes. which subsequently fuse to form a single primitive heart tube. The latter becomes S-shaped and it begins to beat, and then it joins with the blood vessels. Development of the chorionic villi and the placenta. So an embryonic tissue invades the uterine wall. Maternal uterine vessels are eroded and maternal blood fills spaces called the lacuna within the invading tissue. So finger-like projections of the chorion called chorionic villi grow and blood capillaries develop within them. They continue growing until they are bathed in maternal blood sinuses called the intervillous spaces. However, the maternal and the fetal blood does not normally mix. So exchange of substances occur between the maternal blood and the intervillous spaces and the fetal blood flowing through the capillaries within the chorionic villi. Placentation is the process of forming the pancake-shaped structure called the placenta, which is the site of exchange of nutrients and waste between the mother and the fetus. The actual connection between the placenta and the embryo is through the umbilical cord, and it develops from the connecting stalk. So it consists of these blood vessels. We have 2 umbilical arteries that carry the deoxygenated fetal blood and waste from the fetus to the placenta. We have 1 umbilical vein that carries oxygenated blood and nutrients from the placenta into the fetus. And then we have supporting mucous connective tissue called Wharton's jelly that develops from the allantois, A-L-L-A-N-T-O-I-S. So the entire umbilical cord is surrounded by a shiny layer of amnion. After birth, the placenta detaches from the uterus and is called the afterbirth. The area where the umbilical cord was attached to the infant becomes scar tissue called the umbilicus, which we call the navel. Okay, now the 4th week of development, organogenesis. This is the development of the body organs and systems. It begins during the 4th through the 8th weeks of development, and significant events during the 4th week. So the 5th weeks of development, so the significant events that happen then include rapid development of the brain and the head, development of distinct limb, like arms and leg regions, further development of the eyes and ears, and the tail disappears. The external genitals begin to differentiate. By the end of the 8th week, the embryo has clearly human characteristics. Now we go into the fetal period. So the remaining months of development are the fetal period, during which time the fetus continues to develop and grows at a remarkable rate. Organs grow rapidly and the fetus takes on a human appearance. By the end of the 3rd month, the placenta is functioning.